There's a certain way people pause before they say something they know will cut too polite to be direct, too rehearsed to be honest. I had just finished scrubbing the faint coffee ring off the corner of the kitchen table. The cloth still held the warmth of the kettle when the phone buzzed across the counter. Liam's name lit up. I wiped my hands on the apron, hesitated, then tapped the speaker button. His voice came quickly, as if he hoped to outrun whatever weight his words might carry. "Hey, Mom. Just wanted to let you know Delilah and her mom had some thoughts about the engagement dinner." My hands hovered over the drawer. The one where I kept serving spoons for company I hadn't had in a while. He didn't wait for me to respond. "They think it might be better if you didn't come. It's not personal. It's just the venue's intimate and Delilah's family's planning most of it. They want to keep things streamlined." Streamlined. I turned toward the mail pile. One envelope had been resting there since Thursday unopened, the kind with ivory cardstock and raised lettering. The seal shimmered gold, shaped like a crest I didn't recognize. I opened it while he spoke. Inside, a folded invitation and a note. The formal card was printed with floral borders, listing the hosts and honorees, Delilah's parents, the Everstons, and a series of names I didn't recognize. My name wasn't among them. The note was handwritten, just 2 lines in an elegant, almost old-fashioned script. "Thank you for respecting the tone we're curating, M.E." That was all, M.E. I didn't need to guess. Marjorie Everston had signed her disapproval with grace. Liam's voice returned uncertain now. "She just thinks it might stir up less tension between generations, different styles." I pressed the edge of the note under the sugar jar, aligning the paper so it sat flat, like it might behave better that way. "She's very particular," he added. "You know how she is. I knew. I had known the first time she scanned my coat at dinner like it belonged in the utility closet. It's not about you, Mom." That phrase. It always landed with a quiet thud, like a book closed without being read. Not about me. But it came to me. The clicking of his voice slowed. He waited for an answer, but none arrived. Finally, I heard him exhale. "All right. I'll talk to you later." The line disconnected. I picked up the invitation again. The card smelled faintly of rosewater. There were checkboxes near the bottom. Will attend, will not attend, will join remotely. There wasn't a box for wasn't welcome. I turned it over. No return envelope. No RSVP instructions. Just the assumption that I'd comply with silence. I walked to the sink, poured the rest of my tea down the drain. Cinnamon clung to the inside of the cup like it didn't want to leave. I rinsed it twice. The apron still held a faint circle of flour from the waffles I hadn't made. I folded it and set it across the back of the chair, smoothing the crease. In the drawer near the stove was a small tin with old address labels. One still had Noah's name printed beneath mine, his letters faded, barely readable now. I ran a finger across them, just enough pressure to remind myself they were still there. I hadn't opened the curtain yet. Morning light slanted through the glass in strips landing across the envelope on the table. The shadow from the sugar jar fell across Marjorie's signature. The comma-shaped chip on the lid caught a gleam. I didn't sit down. I reached into the coat closet and took out the navy jacket. The elbow had thinned where I used to lean into counters preparing dinner for 3. Now I wore it on walks alone. The lining had a small tear mended once with black thread. Not perfect, but kept. Before stepping outside, I checked the calendar on the wall. A red circle marked the date of the engagement dinner. I had drawn it a month ago after Liam had said, "Of course you'll be there, Mom." I didn't erase it. The front porch creaked as I stepped onto it. Across the street, the maple tree was shedding the last of its leaves. They spiraled slowly, almost deliberately. A few clung to branches near the top, curled and brittle. The air carried the smell of early winter, and something faintly burnt like toast left too long in someone else's kitchen. The neighborhood was quiet. No one noticed I stood there. I thought about the years I'd spent making sure others felt comfortable. Choosing the second best piece of pie. Taking the photo instead of being in it. Agreeing to drive, but not deciding where we'd go. The silence now didn't feel unfamiliar. It just felt more honest. A car passed without slowing. Its tires hissed against the curb. I didn't wave. There had been no fight. No dramatic words. Just a phone call, a folded card, a name missing from a list. And now a woman standing on her own porch, holding a jacket closed at the chest, as if bracing against something colder than the wind. I didn't call anyone back. I didn't send a message. I simply stood still, and I thought perhaps for the first time that some erasures happen not in anger, but in comfort. Because it's easier to exclude someone who never insists on being seen. It's easier to exclude someone who never insists on being seen. It's strange how easily you can disappear without ever leaving the room. I still remember the first time I met Marjorie Everston. I wore the navy dress, not the expensive one, just the one with the stitched neckline I'd fixed myself when the seam split. I brought lemon bars on a ceramic tray. Delilah answered the door and looked me up and down just once. "Oh, that's cute," she said, then turned and walked away. Inside the house was full of chatter that moved around me like a river split by stone. I smiled at everyone, nodded when they looked over, placed the tray on the table without interrupting the conversation. Marjorie was holding a flute of champagne, wearing earrings that looked like they could hear things before anyone spoke. She didn't shake my hand. She tilted her head and said, "Liam's always been drawn to softer women." That was the first time I noticed how compliments can hold teeth. I didn't reply. I smiled again, the same way I did during my performance reviews when I was told my reliability was appreciated more than my leadership. Later that evening, when Delilah brought out the photo albums, I moved to the edge of the room. In every picture, I stood at the back, slightly out of frame. No one asked me to move forward. There was another time, just before the engagement dinner. Delilah came by to talk logistics. She sat at the kitchen counter, twirling her keys between her fingers. "Mama Agnes," she started. That name always sounded like something borrowed. "Do you think maybe skip the speech at the party? Just a toast from Dad and then straight into dinner?" I told her, "Of course. It's your day." I said it like a gift being handed over. That night I wrote a short speech anyway, folded it into the back of my notebook. I never showed it to anyone. The ink blurred slightly at the edge where I rested my hand too long. When they bought the new house, I was there for the first dinner. We sat around the island, no table, yet eating takeout from paper boxes. They talked about colors, about fixtures, about the guest room turning into an office. I listened, nodding. No one asked what I thought of the layout. After the meal, Delilah dropped her fork in the sink and walked away. Liam followed. I stayed behind, washed the dishes, without turning on the light. The window above the sink showed my reflection, but not my outline. Just enough to know I was still there. There was one moment months before when I said something, just a single suggestion. We were discussing bridesmaid dresses. I said sage green might look softer under outdoor light. Delilah's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. Liam stared at his phone. The silence stretched until Delilah said, "Anyway, I think we're doing coral." They changed the subject. I folded the fabric sample back into its plastic sleeve. Every step back felt like the right thing to do. Like I was keeping the water still so no one would notice the weight underneath. At family dinners, I made sure there was enough wine, enough bread, enough for everyone to take home. Delilah once said, "Oh, don't trouble yourself with all this, Agnes. It's not a holiday." And yet she let me clear the plates alone. In the photos she posted online, my arm was sometimes visible, the curve of a shoulder. Never the whole face. I once asked Liam softly if I could help more with the seating chart. He replied, "Delilah has a vision. We're trying to stay out of her way, so I stayed out of theirs." That's the part no one sees. The folding, the self-editing. I didn't stop showing up. I just stopped taking up space. And somehow, even that was too much. When they painted the nursery, I offered to help. Delilah blinked slowly, then said, "We've already hired someone, but thank you." The thank you was the smallest part of that sentence. She called a few weeks later not to ask for anything, but to remind me, "We don't want too many people around the baby in the first few weeks. Doctor's advice." I understood. I mailed a hand-knit blanket anyway. Never heard if it arrived. The last time I tried to contribute an idea, one of those small, hopeful suggestions, I remember Delilah tapping the side of her mug and saying, "It's not really about what you want, is it?" She didn't say it with cruelty. That's what made it worse. It was simply known. There's a ceramic bowl on my shelf that still has a faded name tag under it, from the Whitakers. The ink has almost disappeared, but the glue still holds. I used to think that if I was quiet enough, agreeable enough, they would make room for me. Not a large space, just a place to stand. But I learned something. Silence doesn't always mean space is being offered. Sometimes it's the sound of the door closing behind you. I never pushed back. I never raised my voice. Every time I chose to step back. Not because I thought I was wrong, because I believed being less visible might mean I wouldn't be erased. I kept showing up. I kept folding my thoughts into neat, safe corners. And I kept thinking, maybe this is how you earn your place. But folded corners don't make a page matter more. They only make it easier to skip. I think I first disappeared years ago in a room where everyone could see me. On Liam's 16th birthday, the cake had chocolate curls and his name spelled in gold. The guests filled the kitchen and spilled into the hallway. He opened each gift loudly. New sneakers, concert tickets, a leather wallet from Delilah. Mine was an album I'd spent weeks assembling. I'd sorted photos from his first swim meet, the time he broke his wrist, and still insisted on smiling the Halloween he went as a robot made of painted cardboard. Each photo had a note under it. Just simple things. A year, a line of memory. He peeled the wrapping, opened the first page, and closed it just as quickly. "Oh, thanks, Mom," before sliding it under the table. I noticed it wasn't packed when they moved later that month. At his college graduation, I took the early train from Ashford. The seats were torn, the heater didn't work, and I had to change lines twice. I wore my gray coat, the one I'd kept patched up under the sleeves. I remember waiting at the base of the steps, watching everyone take pictures near the big school seal. Marjorie turned to me after adjusting her scarf. "Oh, you made it," she said. "That coat. Very practical." She didn't look at my shoes, but I did. I'd polished them with the same rag I used on the hallway table. I stood off to the side in every photo. The one they sent for the family album had me cropped out entirely. Just a sliver of my sleeve remained next to Liam's elbow. There was another time, an anniversary dinner, I think. They were celebrating some partnership Delilah had brokered. Everyone raised a glass to the incredible foundation and support of the Everston family. I sat at the end of the table, counting the knots in the wood. My name didn't come up. No one mentioned the check I'd written from the sale of my wedding ring. It had paid for Liam's first year of tuition. I still have the receipt. It's folded in the back of a drawer with a birthday card from when he turned 10. That one was signed, "Love you always." I don't remember if I said it first. In the basement behind the paint cans and an old vacuum, there's a tin box. I keep it sealed with a piece of ribbon, not because it needs tying, just to make it feel like something worth opening. Inside, there's a stack of things that never made it to the mantel upstairs. There's the invitation to the baby shower, where my name was spelled wrong, Agnes Whitehall. Not Whitaker, not even Agnes. Just a printed mistake that no one thought to fix. The ink had bled from the corner where I touched it with a wet hand. I still went. I brought a quilt with stitched stars. It never showed up in the nursery photos. Another envelope holds a thank you note from Delilah. It's blank inside. And then there are the photos. The one from their engagement, everyone smiling in front of the lake arms, linked. I'm off to the side, 1 foot in the grass. In the Christmas photo 3 years ago, they're all wearing red. I'm in navy eyes, half closed. Delilah posted it with the caption, "Family forever." I counted 7 comments. None mentioned the woman standing slightly out of frame. I tried once. Just once. They were discussing colors for the bridesmaids' dresses. I mentioned pale green. "It brings out Liam's eyes," I offered. Delilah didn't respond. Liam cleared his throat. Then the conversation shifted to appetizers. In one group message, I shared an old picture of Liam playing in the yard with his cousins. No one replied. Later, the image was reposted by Marjorie, cropped, captioned, and credited as a family classic. There's a sound people make when they're pretending to listen, a small hum, a half smile, the way they blink slower when they want to move on. I learned to recognize it. It became a kind of punctuation. I heard it often after I mentioned a recipe or reminded them I'd already offered to babysit. Even my presence became a kind of afterthought. "Oh, were you still here?" once slipped out from someone's lips as they cleaned up after dinner. I wasn't invited to that dinner. I had just stopped by with a cake, a plain butter pound with lemon glaze. No one touched it. It sat next to the store-bought pies. There's a thin envelope with a return address I don't recognize. Inside is a holiday card from 3 years back. It begins with, "To our cherished circle, but I was never part of the list below." I only received it, I suppose, out of formality. In one memory, small forgettable, I stood in the hallway as they prepared to take a family portrait. Marjorie adjusted Delilah's hair, smoothed down Liam's collar. I was holding the extra coat someone had left behind. "Agnes," she said, without looking, "maybe step out so it's not too crowded." I folded the coat over my arm and stepped back. They looked beautiful. I ran my fingers along the edge of the printed frame weeks later. It hung straight, perfectly centered, in their foyer. Down in the basement, I laid out the contents of the tin box on the table. Each object had edges. The kind that don't cut, just remind you where things end. A corner of ribbon from a gift never opened. A place card with no table number. A voicemail saved too long that ends with static. I put them all back. I tied the ribbon twice more for me than for the box. I never wanted a spotlight. I only wanted a chair. I never liked the taste of red wine, but I kept the bottle they brought anyway. The label was in Italian gold-foiled and tilted just slightly on the glass. I placed it on the counter without comment, next to the ceramic bowl with 2 pears and an unopened letter from the bank. Liam sat across from me at the kitchen table, his hands folded too neatly for someone with nothing to hide. Delilah poured tea into the cups I had already laid out, though hers went untouched. "We've been thinking a lot about the future," Liam said, running a fingertip along the grain of the table. "Our future, really. Something long-term, more rooted." I looked at his shoes. New soles. Polished leather. Someone had taught him to present well. Someone other than me. Delilah leaned in a bit, her tone soft, like something smoothed too many times. "We found a beautiful place near Mom's, a A 3-bedroom. Big yard, newer kitchen. A real step forward. I folded the edge of the tea napkin twice, then once more. The stitches had started to fray in one corner. It looked like it might give soon. Liam cleared his throat. We made the down payment last week. You always talked about your savings, right? He didn't wait for an answer. I hadn't offered one. Delilah reached for the sugar, didn't use any. This house. It's sweet, but it's more memory than utility now, isn't it? It creaks. The heat's uneven. I nodded once. The heater worked well enough if you understood it, but they never stayed long enough to learn. She smiled like she was wrapping something fragile. You've always been careful with money. This way your savings can do something for the next generation. Liam looked up. I mean realistically. What else are you going to use it for? I got up and walked to the drawer where I kept the envelope folded 3 times, never sealed. The paper was worn where my thumb had rested too many times a smudge over the first 0. I laid it on the table. Delilah's hand twitched. Then I picked it back up and slid it into my cardigan pocket. I'll be putting in a new roof, I said, and booking a trip to Ireland. There was a pause, just long enough to make room for something unpleasant. Ireland. Delilah's voice dipped an octave as if adjusting to a less serious tone. Alone, I didn't answer. I had the brochure in a drawer somewhere. It had a picture of a mossy cliff and a quote about returning to one's origin. I hadn't told anyone I'd mailed the deposit. Liam stared down at his cup, then his phone lit up. Delilah glanced at it and swiped to answer. She tapped the speaker icon and placed it face up on the table. Mother, she said, brushing invisible dust off her sleeve. Marjorie Everston's voice filled the room like a pipe leaking gas, thin, sharp, lingering. Has she come around yet? I assume you brought the paperwork. If she won't attend the event, the least she could do is fund something useful. The Whitaker name needs to stand with dignity. We've carried the weight long enough. I didn't move. The sunlight from the window caught the rim of my spoon. I turned it over. She's here, Delilah murmured, just considering her options. Well, do make it clear. Sentiment doesn't build futures. Assets do. The call ended. No goodbyes. I took the cup I hadn't touched and poured it into the sink. Liam stood, but didn't say anything else. Delilah offered a forced smile as she lifted the wine bottle from the counter. It's a special vintage, she said. Thought you might enjoy it. I nodded. The cork was still sealed. I placed it back beside the pears. After they left, I folded the napkin again and set it neatly in the drawer. The silt of old tea had left a pale ring on the saucer. I didn't scrub it clean. I just ran water until it warmed, then turned it off. In the hallway, the envelope with my travel confirmation stuck out from the mailbox slot. The date was circled faintly in pencil, early May. I traced it once and placed it beneath the photograph of the garden from last spring, where the daffodils came up too early and burned in a late frost. I stepped into the yard. The wind caught the edge of my sweater, and I pressed it back down with both hands. The soil beneath the rosebush had shifted cracked where the roots had grown under the stones. I didn't step over it. I stayed there breathing in the thin air and counting to 10. In their world, I had become a line item, a drawer to be opened for convenience, then closed with measured politeness. They had not asked what I remembered. Not the afternoons I spent clipping coupons to make sure Liam had birthday cakes shaped like trains. Not the box of letters I kept each signed Love Mom even after he stopped writing back. Not the ring I sold for his first semester, the one his father gave me when my hands were young. They had not asked what I wanted, only what I was still good for. I walked to the garden bed where the rosemary had started to bloom. I touched the branch where the bees liked to rest. It was still there, quiet, persistent, doing its work in silence. I stayed there long enough to know they wouldn't call back. and I chose not to speak first. Some people take silence as agreement. Others treat it as absence. I've learned it often means something was noticed and quietly set down. The call to the bank didn't take long. I already had the folder prepared, the account numbers marked in black ink. The voice on the other end asked if I wanted to close the joint access. I didn't answer right away. My thumb was pressed to the small gold seal on the edge of the checkbook. It had faded, but the texture was still there. I moved it aside and said simply that the account would now be under my name only. The woman paused, then processed it. After that, I took the picture frame from the hallway. It was a silver one with a twisted rope border. Inside was the photo from Liam's college graduation. All four of us standing there, Liam holding his degree, Delilah's hand already on his arm, my late husband in his worn brown suit. I pried the back off and slid the photo out without bending it. I folded a sheet of plain paper in its place and closed it up again. The frame went back onto the shelf. The photograph I tucked between two recipe books I hadn't opened in years. There was a dress I'd bought last month, dark teal with a subtle floral lining. I had thought it would do for the rehearsal dinner. The fabric still had the store crease, the receipt folded inside the bag. I didn't try it on again. I placed it in the donation bin near the front closet. Not out of impulse, but decision. The box marked wedding had been ready for months. Inside were wrapped glasses, a handmade card I never signed, and a small linen envelope with a check that remained unwritten. I taped it shut, and on the top wrote in pencil, "Do not open." Not a warning, just a quiet instruction. Delilah's message came that afternoon. "Hope you understand, we want the wedding to feel elegant. Guests should reflect the event. It's not about individuals." I read it twice, then once more aloud without sound. I replied with one line, "Thank you for the reminder. I won't be attending." No emojis, no period. I watched the screen until the delivered mark appeared, then turned off the phone. The house was quieter after that, not because no one called, but because I had stopped expecting they would. I watered the plant near the kitchen window, trimmed the dead leaves from the basil, and deleted the shared calendar link Liam had sent me last spring. I didn't cry. That was not the shape of this moment. I removed the old key from the hook one Delilah used when she came early to set the table or drop off gifts she didn't want to carry. I placed it in a small wooden box with 2 buttons, a dried clover, and my mother's cameo brooch. Then I closed the lid and pushed it to the back of the drawer. The text thread with Liam was still open on my phone. The last message from him read, "Delilah's mom is handling most of the guest stuff. Don't worry about anything. Just show up and smile." That had been 6 weeks ago. The space between his words and mine had grown without anyone noticing. When I sat down that evening, I poured 1 glass of water and placed a coaster under it. Not because I expected company, but because I always had. The coaster had a ring mark that never quite came out, a faint echo of something that once mattered. I checked the weather in County Kerry. Overcast. Low chance of rain. I circled the travel dates in my planner using a pen I'd found tucked in a drawer beside the batteries and loose stamps. It was still smooth. I began packing, not as escape, but as reordering. A small suitcase barely filled. A book I had read before, 1 cardigan, a scarf with a tiny burn mark near the edge. I folded each item carefully, not as ritual, but as respect. The zipper moved slow. Not stuck, just deliberate. Its teeth clicked like a clock, then sealed. The sound felt final. Not like a goodbye, more like the closing of a drawer that would not be opened again. I didn't tape over the name tag. I left it blank. There were no accusations, no dramatic speeches. I hadn't written letters to explain myself. They hadn't noticed the change in tone. They hadn't seen that I no longer reached for the phone first, or that the gifts once waiting near the stairs were gone. What stayed behind a neat drawer, a balanced account, and the quiet click of a suitcase. They had said I wasn't the right presence for their day. They had said it wasn't personal, and in return I had said nothing they could argue with. Because absence when chosen is a kind of boundary that cannot be crossed. Not with apologies too late. Not with invitations once rescinded. Not with names that forget how they were spoken in childhood. I closed the light in the hallway, placed the unused invitation envelope in the shred pile, and looked once at the space where the photo frame had sat. I didn't replace it with anything. Some shelves don't need to be filled again. I thought the roof would be the hardest part, but it turned out to be the easiest to replace. The contractors came on a Thursday. They were polite, quiet, efficient. I didn't try to make conversation. I had already chosen the color charcoal, not because it matched anything, but because it didn't need to. One of the men asked if I wanted the decorative trim kept. I shook my head. It had always looked too proud for a house that never asked to be noticed. The old heating pipe in the basement had rusted through. I found the spot by following the sound of slow dripping. I circled it with a red marker, left a note for the plumber. I added a second note. Don't cover this with tape. Replace it. The handwriting didn't look like mine. It was steadier. The next morning, I boiled water and chose chamomile instead of black tea. I didn't check the phone while it steeped. I sat by the window and opened the small spiral notebook I'd bought years ago but never used. The first page had only one sentence. Month 1, living without being invited, and no longer waiting for the invitation. I tore the corner gently just enough to see how thick the paper was. It held ink without bleeding. Later that day, I walked to the library. I hadn't been inside since before Liam moved out. The new wing smelled of paint and carpet glue. I signed up for a photography workshop held in the basement meeting room. The sign-up sheet had only 2 names before mine. I printed mine slowly, evenly. I didn't abbreviate. I didn't leave room for someone to shorten it. They asked what kind of camera I used. I said I didn't have one. They said, "You can borrow one from the desk." No one raised a brow. No one glanced at their watch. When I returned home, I went through the documents drawer in the office. My old passport was tucked behind utility bills and a faded copy of the deed. It had expired 38 years ago. The photo showed a woman in a linen blouse with eyes too focused to be relaxed. I placed it beside the new application form and began filling it in one box at a time. Under place of birth, I paused. Then I wrote Bethesda, not Bethesda, mother of Liam Whitaker, or Bethesda, former wife of Harold Whitaker. Just one word, black ink, no modifiers. The kitchen clock ticked with a low drag. I hadn't noticed it ran slow. I opened a drawer near the pantry where I used to keep invitations, coupons, and clipped recipes. The only thing left inside was a thank you card from Liam, and Delilah never sent still blank. I closed the drawer and used the space for a small stack of lined stationery. When I wrote my full name across the first sheet, I wrote it, how I heard it in my own voice, not theirs. The pen hesitated on the loop of the G, but followed through. I let the ink dry before folding it and placing it in the drawer. I found an old apron that still had flour marks near the hem. I washed it, hung it to dry in the guest bathroom. I wasn't expecting guests. I just didn't like the idea of it staying stained. One afternoon, a woman from across the street waved as I brought in the mail. She pointed to the scaffolding and asked new owners. I told her no. She smiled politely, then said, "Good to see someone taking care of it." I didn't correct her. I didn't tell her I'd always taken care of it. That evening, I reattached the loose button on my coat. I used thread that didn't quite match. I didn't mind. The tea canister now sat beside a small vase with dried lavender. I used to keep sugar cubes there. I'd stopped buying them when Liam told me they looked dated. The lavender had no use, but it kept its color. The house smelled different now. Less of meals, more of windows being opened. When I reached for the file labeled medical, I pulled out the old appointment cards and set them aside. I found the one from the rheumatologist, creased from being in my purse too long. I wrote the next follow-up in my own planner in pen, no longer waiting on anyone to remind me. The robe I used to keep for guests, the one in pale blue, had a loose thread near the collar. I clipped it and placed the robe in the linen closet. I didn't fold it perfectly. I left it easy to reach. I took one of the old chairs from the dining room and moved it into the back hallway. I had no purpose in mind. It just no longer needed to stay part of a matching set. A voicemail from Marjorie came through while I was writing a grocery list. She said, "We'll assume you're sitting this one out. You always were more private." Her voice had the sharpness of perfume sprayed too close to skin. I didn't play it again. That night, I took the old necklace from the drawer by the bed. It wasn't gold or valuable, just a piece of green glass on a leather cord. I wore it when Liam was young, before his father's business card started saying executive partner. The cord had thinned the clasp loose. I wore it around the house anyway. It didn't need an occasion. I flipped back to the notebook, added a new line beneath the first. No longer mistaken for missing, because I wasn't missing. I was finally present, only now, for myself. I used to believe silence meant peace, but now I know it also gives others the space to plan what they'll take next. The envelope was heavier than it needed to be. Inside, the flight ticket to Dublin was printed in black ink, the way old receipts used to fade when they'd been kept too long in a warm drawer. I left it on the side table beside my passport. Neither of those things had ever left the country, until now. A text came in before noon. "Mom, we're short on the house deposit. You mentioned that savings account." Remember, I didn't reply. I turned the page of the photography catalog from the library. The corners curled slightly where I'd dog-eared them. Habit, not need. They showed up 2 days later. Liam carried a bottle of something with a cork, though he didn't offer to open it. Delilah had a cardigan folded neatly over her arm, as if the visit was temporary, professional, not familial. They sat like people waiting for a signature, not a conversation. Liam tapped his phone once, then looked up with a practiced grin. "I remember you saying something about using that money for the wedding gift. You didn't get around to giving it, but, well, we're at the final payment. It's almost the exact amount." I let the kettle continue its slow roll before removing it from the burner. The steam left a small mark on the window pane that faded just as Delilah reached for a teacup. "We talked about this, Agnes," she said, smoothing the napkin beside her. $6,400 used wisely could help a family start strong. Flights and hotels. It just seems a little indulgent considering everything. The handle of my cup was chipped, just a sliver near the top where my index finger naturally curled. I remembered the moment it cracked. I'd never replaced it. Liam leaned forward. "We're not saying don't enjoy yourself, but it's about priorities. You're spending my future on a vacation." The cup touched the saucer too quietly to be heard, but I imagined the sound anyway. I didn't mention the roof repairs or the heating system I'd upgraded. I didn't bring up the hours spent researching local contractors, comparing quotes, choosing a teal gray that matched the shutters. None of that apparently counted as contribution. "You raised me to be responsible," Liam added, "to plan ahead. You said we don't waste opportunities in this family." I looked at the leather strap of his watch. The stitching was slightly frayed. He'd worn it for years, likely a gift from me. He still twisted it unconsciously, the way he had when nervous as a child. Delilah reached into her tote and pulled out a thin envelope. "We drafted a small agreement. Nothing legal, of course. Just a note so you know where the money's going. She slid it across the table, careful not to smudge her nails. I didn't open it. Instead, I reached beneath the placemat and took out the small notebook where I now tracked travel plans and appointments. I'd underlined the departure date. I traced it once with the side of my thumb. I'm going to Ireland, I said. Not because I owe anyone, but because I don't. Delilah's eyes narrowed. By yourself? That's unusual. Liam's voice followed flatter this time. You're being emotional. This isn't practical. It's selfish, honestly. I placed the notebook down gently so the corner aligned with the wood grain of the table. I folded the envelope and handed it back. I'm spending what I earned, not what you lost. Delilah shifted in her seat. Her hand hovered above the cup, as if unsure whether to take another sip. It's just. When older people make choices like this, it impacts the whole family. Liam didn't look at me when he stood. He didn't say goodbye. He left the wine unopened. I stayed at the table, tracing the heat ring left by the kettle. Years ago, he'd drawn spaceships in that spot with a crayon. I never scrubbed it clean. The mark had softened with time, but never vanished. They didn't see the passport. They didn't ask what town I'd land in. They didn't wonder who I might meet. The trip to them was an inconvenience. I had once considered sending them postcards, just one or two. A photo of a cathedral, a handwritten note, simple things. Now I wasn't sure they'd read them, or if I wanted them to. A voicemail came later that night. I didn't listen. I deleted it. I pressed the boarding pass flat again and placed it under a book to keep the corners from curling. The ticket wasn't to escape. It was to confirm something. Something none of them had thought to name. When I reached for the travel wallet, the corner caught on the edge of the table and peeled a thread. I clipped it with scissors, not because it bothered me, but because it was mine to trim. Liam once told me I was over-careful, that I overthought birthdays, overwrapped gifts, overdid casseroles. You always take things so seriously, he had said. And now he took lightly what I considered deliberate. The last message he sent came in the morning. Fine. Just don't expect us to wait around when you're done playing independent. I didn't reply. I just folded the sweater I'd packed and placed it into the carry-on beside the book of Irish poetry I'd found in the library donation pile. The one with the handwritten inscription, "To the traveler who never asked for permission." No one had asked if I'd be okay. No one had asked what I wanted. I didn't hold that against them, but I no longer left space at the table for their questions. I used to believe that if no one was watching, then nothing counted. The lens felt heavier in my hands than I remembered. Not because of its weight, but because of what it asked of me: stillness. Not the kind that waits for permission, but the kind that listens before pressing the shutter. I joined the photography group quietly, with no announcement. No profile picture, just initials and a borrowed email from the library computer when mine refused to connect. The first session was at the retirement home on Elm. They didn't expect anyone to show up. I brought my own folding stool. The woman at the front desk looked me up and down and asked if I was with the volunteers or just visiting someone. I said I brought my camera. She handed me a sticker with no smile. A man named Hal let me take his photo first. He wore 2 watches, one working, one not. He said I wear the broken one to remember my wife's nap times. I didn't know if he was joking. I took the photo anyway. When I showed it to him, he whispered, "She would have liked this. She always said I looked more honest in profile." I wrote that down later in the back of the little spiral notebook where I used to keep grocery lists. One of the women, Elaine, had a brooch shaped like a clock with no hands. She'd pinned it to a scarf that used to be red, now soft and almost gray. When I asked if I could photograph her, she looked at me for a long time before answering, My daughter said no one wants pictures of people this close to dying. I sat beside her a moment before lifting the camera. When the light hit her eyes, they didn't flinch. I didn't need to say anything. The click was enough. Back home, I printed the images on matte paper and taped them along the kitchen wall. No frames, just the edge of painter's tape folded into corners. I noticed the curve in Hal's back, the way Elaine held her fingers, like she was still threading yarn. These weren't portraits for memory. They were proof that dignity didn't ask for applause. I posted Elaine's photo to the community photography forum. I didn't title it. Just uploaded, closed the tab, and went to brew tea. When I checked the next morning, the top comment read, "Thank you for capturing the kind of gaze people turn away from too quickly." There was no icon beside the comment, just a gray silhouette and a name I didn't recognize. But the words stayed with me longer than I expected. I wrote them on a Post-it note and stuck it beside the thermostat. I began photographing more. The hands of a woman sorting rosary beads. A man who refused to look into the lens but smiled as he shaved. I didn't pose anyone. I didn't adjust their hair or clear the background. Whatever was there, wheelchairs, oxygen lines, plastic cups with straws, I kept it. At night, I sat with the stack of printed photos and trimmed the edges. I marked the backs with initials and dates. Sometimes I found myself humming. Not songs I remembered, but sounds that didn't ask for company. Delilah never commented, but she saw. I knew she saw. A mutual acquaintance from her old college group shared one of my photos on a community board. The caption read, "Local hobbyist brings light to forgotten faces." Delilah sent no message. But I saw the notification viewed by D. Whitaker. Later that week, Liam sent a forwarded job listing something about event coordination and senior outreach. I didn't open the attachment. They came by the next Sunday earlier than usual. No wine this time. Just a tin of cookies still in the grocery bag. Delilah glanced at the prints along my wall and paused a little longer than she meant to. Her voice was lower when she said, "I didn't know you were doing this." I folded the dish towel in my hands. The edge had a small rip I hadn't sewn. Liam opened the tin of cookies, offering one like it was a favor. "Looks like you found something to keep you occupied." I placed the tin on the counter without looking at it. He pulled out a folded slip of paper from his coat. "I thought maybe you'd want to contribute to the anniversary project for the family. They're collecting old photos, doing a display. Something from when you were younger, something people would recognize." I didn't respond. I walked over to the drawer and pulled out an envelope. Inside, I'd placed a single photo, one I took last week. Hal asleep in the garden hands, folded sunlight on his knees. I slid it across the table. This one matters more to me now. Delilah's lips parted, but she didn't speak right away. Her fingers brushed over the edge of the photo, hesitating. Then quieter than I'd ever heard her. Do you ever wonder if we misunderstood you?" I picked up my mug. The tea had gone cold. The rim still held the faint trace of chamomile. She stood up slowly. Liam followed, frowning. At the door, he said something under his breath. Something about playing the martyr. I didn't respond. I watched the door close, then returned to the photo on the table. Elaine's words circled in my head like a thread stitched loose. My daughter doesn't visit. But I live on because I know I still matter. I hadn't said much that day, but when she looked at the lens and let it catch her without turning away, I understood what she meant. Not every story needs readers. Some just need to be told. I never thought a piece of paper could feel heavier than a box of dishes. Yet the folder sat on my lap like it knew too much. I didn't rush to open it. The lawyer had already explained everything twice, slowly, without ceremony. I had nodded without interrupting. That was enough. The pen was dark green, a cheap kind they keep in reception jars. It smeared when I signed the new documents, but I didn't bother wiping the ink off my thumb. The smudge stayed there through lunch, and even later when I took off my shoes by the front door, it was still faint on my skin. I didn't call anyone afterward. There was no announcement, no need for a witness. I just walked to the shelf, reached for the old wooden frame, and turned it around. The photo inside Liam's fifth-grade portrait stayed in place, but I knew I wouldn't be looking at it again. The new will removed his name completely. I didn't do it to punish. I did it because there's a difference between being born to someone and recognizing their life. The savings account, the property deed, the box of letters Victor once wrote to me, all moved under a different trust now. I left everything to the senior care center where I'd been taking portraits, and a new grant under my name, a scholarship for women over 50 who wanted to start again. When Delilah rang the doorbell, I almost didn't answer. She stood there with both hands around a tote bag, as if it could protect her from whatever she'd come to say. Her shoes were the same beige pair I'd seen at the wedding, only scuffed, now the toes slightly bent upward from overuse. She didn't ask to come in. She just looked down and spoke. I came because I know I didn't speak up. I watched it happen and I chose not to interfere. I stepped aside. She followed me into the kitchen. The kettle had just finished and I poured water into 2 cups. She didn't touch hers. I should have said something that day, she continued, when he called you disposable. Her voice dropped at the end of the word like it hurt more to say aloud than to think. I didn't respond. I placed her cup closer. Steam curled toward her, but she didn't look up. I didn't stop my mother either, she said when she told the planner to leave your name off the seating chart. I told myself it wasn't my call, but it was. I listened without folding my arms, without blinking too often. I let silence sit between us like a third guest at the table. Her fingers played with a loose thread on the edge of her sleeve. I'm not here to ask for anything, she added, but if you'd consider it, I would like you to take a photo for us. Just one, a real one. Not for the mantle, just for us to remember who we were supposed to be at the beginning. I reached into the drawer near the stove and pulled out a manila envelope. Inside was the first portrait I ever took on my own. An older man laughing in a park sunlight, catching the edge of his glasses. He'd told me this light makes me look younger than I feel. I hadn't told him he looked just right. I laid the photo down between us. If you understand where the light in this picture comes from, I said, then maybe you'll know what kind of photo I take now. She didn't speak. Her eyes rested on the image, but I could tell she wasn't seeing just the paper. She was trying to understand the gap between what is captured and what is deserved. I didn't offer promises, didn't ask about Liam, didn't bring up the money. Instead, I stood and reached for a small hand-bound booklet I'd left near the window. It was a sample I'd made for the center, a project of portraits and small handwritten notes from the women there. One of them Helen had written, "No one visits, but I finally feel seen." I'd placed her words on the back cover. Delilah took the booklet in both hands and flipped through it slowly. When she reached Helen's page, her breath caught. Her hands trembled slightly, not enough for drama, just enough for me to notice. "You're different," she said finally. I didn't answer. I just lifted my cup, the one with the crack, along the handle I hadn't bothered gluing. It still held tea. Still worked. She stood after a while. "I'll leave now. Thank you for letting me speak. I don't expect anything else." At the door, she turned once more. "If there's ever a day you decide to take that photo, you don't need to tell us. Just let us know where to stand." She left the cup on the table still full. I washed it later, not right away. The imprint from her fingertip on the rim faded under warm water. No stain, no chip, just a clean curve left behind. I returned to the folder from the lawyer and placed it inside the drawer beside my bed, along with the first roll of film I'd developed last month and the small envelope of pressed wildflowers someone from the center had given me. I didn't write a note to Liam. There was nothing left that required explanation. Not after the silence had already spoken louder than the ceremony. When I turned out the light that night, I didn't think about inheritance. I thought about aperture. How a camera doesn't demand light, it just adjusts for what's there. Some things don't need to be passed down to matter. Some things, finally, are mine. I didn't need proof that I'd been somewhere worth remembering. The kettle clicked off by itself. I didn't rush to pour. A curl of steam rose from the spout, like it knew where to go. I left it there and reached for the wooden box on the shelf above the bread drawer, darker now from years of handling its edges worn soft. I opened the lid. Inside my passport, folded itinerary, and a matchbook from a cafe in Dublin I never sat down in. I hadn't traveled for anyone else. That was the difference this time. Not to visit, not to attend, not to accompany. I walked through old alleys with no intention of being found. The album sat beside my tea mug. No titles on the cover. Just a matte gray binding and a crease in the back from where I'd leaned on it too long one night. I hadn't taken a single photo of myself, not even a reflection. I turned the page to a woman selling ribbons near a stone bridge. Her hands were stained with dye, but her eyes were clean. She hadn't asked me anything, only nodded when I raised the lens. I nodded back. The doorbell didn't startle me. Through the window, I saw Liam holding the bouquet, as if it belonged to someone else. Beside him, Delilah clutched a wooden box familiar. I hadn't seen it since the day I gave it to them unopened during their engagement dinner. She carried it now like something she meant to return. When I opened the door, no one spoke at first. Liam lowered his eyes. There's no good way to undo things. But I don't expect to be right. I only hope I'm not too late. Delilah shifted. Her voice cracked, but her words were clear. I believed you weren't trying, but I never tried to understand you either. That's on me. I stepped back, not out of invitation, but because my hand didn't reach for the knob. Inside, the kettle had gone cold. I poured the tea anyway. We didn't sit right away. They looked around like guests in a house they used to live in. The album was still on the table open to the page, with the ribbon seller. Delilah placed the wooden box beside it. The lid was unlatched. She hadn't opened it before. Now she did slowly. Inside the pair of linen napkins I'd embroidered the year they were born, one stitched with blue, the other with burgundy. I thought this was just decorative. I didn't know you made these. You didn't ask. Liam glanced at the wall behind me. A frame hung there now, one of my own photographs printed large. It wasn't a portrait, just the corner of a window with frost catching the morning. He reached into his coat. A folded letter. Handwritten. I rewrote mine too. Not to fix anything, just to say what I meant the first time. Before I could respond, another car pulled up. Tires quiet on gravel. I recognized the shape of the woman before she stepped out. Marjorie wore a wool coat, plain gray, the sort of thing I imagined she used to wear before tailored silks and tailored opinions. She walked with no rush, a thin envelope in one hand. In the other, a print my photograph of Delilah in the church doorway, light falling on her face like memory. She stopped 2 steps from the porch. I didn't come to reclaim anything she said. I came to admit I never offered anything of worth to begin with. No one moved. The air was still. I saw the picture, she continued. It wasn't her dress or the setting. It was her expression. I realized I'd never looked at her long enough to see it. She handed the envelope to me. Inside was no check, no list, no letterhead. Just a typed note on cream stock. You made me notice my own daughter. We sat, the 5 of us. Not all at once and not by arrangement. There was no table setting, no speeches. Just mismatched mug cinnamon cookies from an old tin and a pot of Earl Grey refilled twice. I had invited no one, but none had come expecting to be served. Later, when the light shifted, I brought out the paper. Not old legal files, new ones. My revised will printed in clean font, names clear and margins uncreased. I handed Liam the document. He didn't unfold it right away. "It's not about inheritance," I said. "It's about who gets named when I no longer can." Delilah reached for my hand. Her grip was no longer tight with hope or loose with guilt. Just steady. Hannah, who had sat beside me quietly the entire time, leaned in. "I don't think we lost you," she said. "I think we didn't listen long enough." When the chairs emptied and the door closed without sound, I stayed in the kitchen. I rinsed the teapot and left it to dry without wiping it. The streak on the spout would catch the next morning's sun. On the shelf above the stove, a small wooden plaque hung, one I'd carved myself, once out of scrap pine. The letters were uneven, but I hadn't sanded them smooth. That would have taken out the part I needed to remember. "Be still. You are already enough." I pressed my fingers to the edge of it. For the first time in my life, I didn't need to whisper the words out loud, and I didn't need anyone to agree.